All right. Hello, everybody. I am going to be with you in just a second. What happened? I can't get any back. Oh, my goodness. I don't know why, you guys. This is funny. Live television right here on the internet, and we'll see if we can figure it out. Might take me a moment. So here's what we're going to do. 2 minutes in onto the show here, and that's 2 minutes I can cut if I get back and edit it. But anyway, good morning. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives, and it's my really great pleasure and honor to present to you an introduction to Anton Chaitkin's volume 2 of his book, called Who We Are. And this summary of the contents is which I have up on the screen, I think is the best place that we can go ahead and start. So let's just go through and investigate together his captions of the titles of the chapters. Lincoln Enters the World Contest, The Slave Empire, Henry Carey and the Rise of Abraham Lincoln, Three Days That Shaped the Modern World, Greenbacks, Lincoln versus the Money Power, Agricultural Reform, Why Farmers Fought for the People's Department, quote unquote, Tom Scott and the Pennsylvania Railroad in the Civil War, Steel as a National Product, the Nation Builders in Reconstruction, Fighting for a New South, the Northern Pacific, the Imperial Attack, and the Rise of Economic Royalists, Palmer's Strategy for the American West, Edison and the Promise of Universal Progress, America and the World, and then Appendix 1, John Quincy Adams on America's Sins Against the Indians, Appendix 2, Lincoln's Northern Adversaries Celebrate His Murder, Appendix 3, Bismarck, the Pope, and the Birth of Catholic Social Doctrine, Appendix 4, Garfield's Assassin Explains the Act, and Appendix 5, James Bullock, Teddy Roosevelt's uncle and mentor, funded the Lincoln assassination. Well, 600 pages, and we are going to open up the book now and get back to chapter 1. I'm going to skip the introduction and the detailed comments, so forgive me for scrolling. It's whatever technical problem is keeping me from fixing my icon. I don't know any other way to do it than to just keep scrolling. So apologize if it bothers you that I'm rolling this stuff past us, but there's the introduction. I'm going to skip that because I want to get into Abraham Lincoln. And here we are. Lincoln Enters the World Contest. So before I start reading, I just want to, why did I choose this part of the book? Because Abraham Lincoln is becoming a kind of a cast in stone relic of the past in our American history books. We don't specifically celebrate his birthday anymore. We don't celebrate his life, or even very often read the Gettysburg Address, as always we did in grade school. We have not taken any interest in the principles that he developed and lived his life by. And we are tending to kind of lump him in with the globalists in some ways because of his willingness to use the greenback dollar and his um, fighting for the northeastern banks and their political philosophy of basically conquering the South. Well, that idea belies everything that he wrote about and stood for during his political life, which was very, very long. And Anton Chaitkin is going to explain it to us, so I'll just go ahead and start reading. Lincoln Enters the World Contest, Why Lincoln is Unknown Today. When people are asked to name their favorite president, they often choose Abraham Lincoln. He is honored for saving the Union and ending slavery. He is loved for his mercy and for his humor. But people are stumped if asked, what government policies did Lincoln believe in? As will be seen in this volume, the principles Lincoln fought for throughout his adult life informed his presidential leadership, resulting in vast accomplishments that transformed the economy and brought on modern times in much of the world. Lincoln believed that all human beings have a right to a decent living standard and to peace, and that government must promote the people's progress toward a better life. This world outlook was known as the American system to distinguish it from the British imperial system. This viewpoint is anathema to today's Anglo-American globalist leaders. Their world order is based on cheap labor in the name of free markets and perpetual war against the latest designated enemies. Teachers and historians who conform their thinking to this prevailing ideology bury their natural curiosity, do not look too deeply into these matters, and simply omit any reference to views such as Lincoln's. Carey defines the two systems. We begin with a statement expressing the viewpoint of the progressive nationalist political movement to which Abraham Lincoln belonged. It was written in 1851 by Philadelphia economist Henry C. Carey, 1793 to 1879, who would be Lincoln's economic advisor and the foremost American political strategist of the mid-19th century. And this is a quote. Two systems are before the world. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism. The other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action, and civilization. One looks toward universal war, the other towards universal peace. One is the English system, the other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world. Such is the true mission of the people of these United States, to raise the value of labor throughout the world. We need only to raise the value of our own, to prove that among the people of the world, whether agriculturalists, manufacturers, or merchants, there is perfect harmony of interests, and that the happiness of individuals, as well as the grandeur of nations, is to be promoted by perfect obedience to that greatest command of all commands, quote, do unto others as you would that others should do unto you, unquote, is the object and will be the result of that mission. Carey campaigned against the British Empire prescription of what they call free markets and free trade. This doctrine dictates that the people have no right for their economic interests to be promoted by their national government, except for the protection of already existing property of the wealthy. The United States, instituting independent government under President George Washington and Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, had proposed a contrary system. The people had the right to rise in skill and new wealth through industrial and scientific progress, promoted by their government through protective tariffs, a national bank that directed credit productively, and infrastructure projects. Carey's exposition of two systems expressed the underlying reality that Britain and America were not merely national rivals, but represented the world's two main contending interests, the predatory empire versus the self-governing nations. When the cited Carey book came out in 1851, this fundamental conflict loomed over the United States with increasing menace. The Southern plantation slave system had continued from the era of British rule before the American Revolution. Mass cotton production had made the slave South an economic and political component of the British imperial order, even though the United States had an independent national government. Most of the cotton was exported to Britain, and there it was worked up into textiles for the world market. With their advanced machinery and lower wages than in America, British manufacturers were able to sell their products inside the United States at low prices that American factories could not match. England supplied cheap clothes for the black slaves who grew the cotton for England, and finery for their masters. Free trade, quote unquote, was an ironic euphemism for a world slave system. British exports of cheap manufactured goods undersold and ruined other countries' industries. The empire thus impoverished subject races and drained them through aristocratic landlords with armies and warships behind them. America's elite slave owners likewise helped their British partners to abort America's founding promise of progress, threatening disunion if their demands were not met. The slavocracy sought to block measures that would render the U.S. independent of the imperial system. Slave owners raged against tariffs that would protect American manufacturing from cheap imports. They fiercely attacked U.S. national control over banking and credit and blocked federal funding for canals and railroads. The Southern slave power and its northern allies, Anglophile merchants and financiers, dominated the Congress, the presidency, and the federal courts from the 1830s through the 1850s. Intensive cotton cultivation exhausted the southeastern soil. Slavery was transplanted westward to the Mississippi Valley. The South demanded the right to spread the slavery zone throughout North America to surround and throttle the free states. Those who fought for American progress contended with a shamelessly brutal enemy. In its final aggressive phase, plantation slavery conformed to the moral standards of its transatlantic sponsors. The British Empire inflicted slavery, starvation, humiliation, drug addiction, and death from colonial wars against condemned peoples in Ireland, India, China, and Africa. That empire betrayed Christianity and debased the West in the eyes of non-Western peoples. American slavery, in partnership with the British Empire, was a continuing offense against the Republic's founding ideals and world reputation. In the drama of national survival leading up to the outbreak of the Civil War, Henry Carey emerged as a senior American strategist, and Abraham Lincoln rose to national prominence as an inspirational opponent of the slave power. The two men, from very different backgrounds, both devoted their lives to advancing the American system of economics, to elevate and equalize the condition of man throughout the world. Their paths would intersect in Lincoln's presidency. when their initiatives would enable escape from conditions that had oppressed mankind since the dawn of time. Henry Carey had witnessed his father changing human destiny, as we have seen in Volume 1 of Who We Are. While Henry was a young man, Matthew Carey, 1770 to 1839, had initiated the fight that revived the Bank of the United States, had written the book that broke up the rotten two-party system, had teamed with Henry Clay to guide the nation toward protective tariffs, and with national banker Nicholas Biddle had shaped the set of institutions that would make Philadelphia the world strategy center for progressive nationalism. Taking his father's counsel over the decades, Henry Carey came to know the global struggle between the two systems personally as his family's history and his destiny. His father had uniquely spoken for national rights in the 1780s revolt of the Irish against British strangulation, had worked for Benjamin Franklin printing American revolutionary literature in France, and had been the leading publisher of Franklin and Hamilton's ideas, expressing the American Republic's founding mission. Henry had taken charge of his father's publishing house, along with Matthew's far-flung intelligence and action network of political, cultural, military, and scientific leaders. In the 1840s, with this legacy, Henry Carey assumed leadership of the American system political movement. Abraham Lincoln had joined that movement in the 1830s when he entered on his tumultuous political life. 3 decades later, the crisis of the Union reached its climax in Lincoln's presidency and the bloody defense against Southern secession. Lincoln, Clay, and the National Political War. Lincoln identified himself politically as a follower of Kentucky statesman Henry Clay. He said of Clay, perhaps describing himself, quote, "His predominant sentiment from first to last was a deep devotion to the cause of human liberty, a strong sympathy with the oppressed everywhere, and an ardent wish for their elevation." Clay aimed to shift America out of the imperial cheap labor system into modern industrial life. Lincoln, in his early childhood, had encountered the evils of that global system in the oppression inflicted on the whole population under the rule of the Southern plantation masters. Lincoln first sought elective office in 1832 at age 23. His candidacy for the Illinois state legislature lined up with the presidential campaign of Henry Clay versus the incumbent Andrew Jackson. It was the year that things started to go horribly wrong for advocates of American progress. From then on, Lincoln would go against the grain of American politics until 30 years later, he himself would turn the tide of U.S. and world affairs. Lincoln's first known political speech was simply a succinct summary of Clay's American system program. And then quoting, "Fellow citizens, I presume you all know who I am. I am humble Abraham Lincoln. I have been solicited by many friends to become a candidate for the legislature. My politics are short and sweet, like the old woman's dance. I am in favor of a national bank. I am in favor of the internal improvement system and a high protective tariff. These are my sentiments and political principles. If elected, I shall be thankful. If not, it will be all the same." Throughout that election year, Clay and his allies fought to retain some of the gains made in the previous decade. That had been the period of national promise when Lincoln had grown to manhood, when pro-national leaders had held sway. The Bank of the United States and the protective tariff had steadied credit and guided investment into new production and transport facilities. Iron output, the basis for much of industry, had grown from about 22,000 tons in 1820 to 224,000 tons in 1832. The policy of promoting this industrial success now came under sharp attack. The entire moral quality of the national government was being degraded. In 1832, South Carolina's rulers, representing the most extreme anti-national element of Southern slave owners, demanded that the protective tariff law passed in 1828 be rescinded. They threatened resistance. In response, Congress passed a reduced tariff of 1832, arranged by the House of Representatives member John Quincy Adams, the former president. Deeming the reduction insufficient, South Carolina declared federal laws were invalid, nullified. In a state that refused compliance, implicitly repealing the Constitution and the Union of the States. President Jackson got a law passed allowing him to use force against South Carolina if necessary, and then signed the Reduced Tariff Act of 1833, cutting rates so much that South Carolina temporarily stopped its threats. In 1832, Henry Clay convinced his close ally Nicholas Biddle, president of the Bank of the United States, to petition the federal government to renew the bank's charter. The Congress passed the new charter. Jackson vetoed the act and ran his presidential campaign as a crusade against the bank. When he won re-election, he pursued the bank's destruction and the shutoff of all federal support for national economic progress. Clay and his allies formed the Whig Party in opposition to Jackson. Cherokees murdered by Jackson and the slaveocracy. In 1832, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that states had no right to make laws regarding Native American land. Seeking to seize Cherokee territory located within Georgia, the state had arrested Christian missionaries who were providing education and aiding Cherokee gradual assimilation. These missionaries were on Cherokee territory, quote, under the authority of the previous President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, and with the permission and approval of the Cherokee Nation, unquote. The Supreme Court ruled the arrests unconstitutional in that the, quote, Treaty of Hopewell, 1785, acknowledges the Cherokees to be under the protection of the United States of America. The Republic's founders had pledged that this land was sovereign territory of the Cherokee Nation. Contemptuous of the court, President Jackson pushed through the forced removal of the tribe from their ancestral lands, killing many on the Trail of Tears. Jackson's brutality represented a shift from the policies of presidents since George Washington, but those who were appalled at the nation's betrayal of faith felt impotent to resist the rage and threats from the slave-owning states directed toward grabbing Indian lands. And see the appendix on John Quincy Adams. How Lincoln built Illinois. This was the deteriorating climate of American politics when Abraham Lincoln first sought elective office, seeking a seat in the Illinois state legislature. He lost his first race, but was subsequently elected to four two-year terms. He became the Whig Party leader in the Illinois House of Representatives and served until 1842. Lincoln's overriding political concern in that period was to build the means of transportation, to bring in new settlers and supplies from the East, and to ship out their crops to Eastern markets. The state's program centered on two crucial proposed projects, a canal and a railroad complex. The Illinois and Michigan Canal aimed to connect Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. It was to complete the system of waterways linking the Atlantic coast through the Great Lakes to the Midwest. Lincoln championed the state project in the legislature. Financing for the I&M Canal seemed assured. During the John Quincy Adams administration, Illinois had been granted federal lands to be sold in order to pay for this canal, and the support of the Bank of the United States was counted upon. In 1836, the state pledged its credit to begin construction and started selling lots for the future city of Chicago at the projected terminus of the canal on the Lake Michigan shore. Canal groundbreaking occurred on July 4th, 1836. The town of Chicago was incorporated early the next year. Illinois' 1837 Internal Improvement Act authorized issuing $7 million in state bonds to build a central railroad running north-south, with Northern Cross and Southern Cross railroads traversing the state east-west. The national policies of Jackson and Van Buren crippled this Illinois development program. The Bank of the United States, demonized and broken, could no longer support the market for state bonds. The speculative bubble in land and cotton prices that had propped up the U.S. economy deflated in 1837. British banks, led by the Bank of England, began shutting off credit and withdrawing gold and silver from the United States. The Panic of 1837 brought in general bankruptcy and mass unemployment. The Illinois could not raise the money to proceed with canal construction and had to sell off the incomplete state railroads to private interests for pennies on the dollar. Abraham Lincoln fought for years to preserve the Illinois infrastructure program. He sought to have the State Bank of Illinois use desperate methods to finance the canal and rail projects, but the state was essentially helpless without broader outside credit. The I&M Canal was delayed for a decade until the state finally negotiated for money in London. The Illinois Central Rail project was completed in the 1850s as a state-chartered private enterprise backed by new federal land grants. Historians and Lincoln's political opponents have blamed him for promoting an impracticable development program. In fact, the eventual completion of the Illinois and Michigan Canal led directly to creating the city of Chicago, which, with its rail links, came to form the center of the world's greatest industrial complex. Millions of working families would earn a good living in that region, manufacturing the tools for American greatness. Lincoln was the pioneer of this colossal accomplishment. Rather than blame Lincoln for financial folly, blame ought to be placed on the enemies of America's progress, who rendered the country defenseless against the imperial system. Lincoln challenges citizens to defy the corrupt establishment. In order to understand what Lincoln was up against, it will be useful to compare the American financial system when it was regulated in the national interest to the times when private moneyed interests have, in effect, regulated the United States. The Bank of the United States issued notes that served as a stable national currency. That national institution prevented private and state banks from ruinous speculation by calling in their notes that were unbacked by reserves and overissued. The bank used the federal funds deposited with it to invest in public interest economic improvements. Proclaiming themselves protectors of the little man against concentrated power, Jackson and Van Buren took down the national bank and turned over the nation's financial life to banking interests unconnected to public purposes. They condemned public investment in infrastructure projects as wasteful spending. Using the battle cry of free trade, slave owners and importers assaulted the protective tariff and brought American commerce under the domination of foreign, particularly British, interests. These policies submerged the country in financial gambling and drained away U.S. capital, inevitably blowing up and sinking the U.S. economy. Lincoln saw the financial system undergo disastrous changes. He himself, as president, would later restore nationally regulated banking to enable great economic advances. In the late 20th century, we saw analogous deregulation. It gave predominant power to controllers of speculative trillions, lords of the offshore banks and the criminal underground economy. When this system inevitably crashed, the government bailed out the perpetrators and put them back on the same insane course. Why does the public allow these things? When politicians do not challenge great interests, they also do not challenge the common man to understand and act on profound matters of national strategy. But Abraham Lincoln increasingly took upon himself responsibility to educate public thinking. He asked the people to carefully consider complex problems and to join him against a powerful establishment that would otherwise herd them as a reactive mob contrary to their own interests. Lincoln began taking a direct part in national politics in the 1840 presidential campaign. President Martin Van Buren was running for re-election as a Democrat versus the Whig Party candidate William Henry Harrison, a hero of the War of 1812. Van Buren had been the mastermind of Andrew Jackson's war against the National Bank, against protective tariffs, and against national funding of infrastructure projects. 2 months after Van Buren himself became president, New York banks had suspended payment on their obligations, touching off the Panic of 1837 and a deep economic depression. Early in the 1840 national campaign, the Illinois Whigs cornered the Democrats into a debate that was staged in the hall of the State House of Representatives. In his opening remarks for the Whigs, Lincoln charged that Jackson and Van Buren had introduced, quote, a new and corrupt system of tactics into the national administration, and that the consummation of this whole scheme of fraud and corruption was in the establishment of the sub-treasury. The sub-treasury, or, quote, independent treasury, unquote, was Van Buren's proposal to place all federal government funds as cash in gold and silver coins to be held personally in different locations by Treasury agents. Lincoln summed up the debate a week later in a lengthy speech on national banking with a startling appeal to the public courage to stand up to the evil gripping the country. It would go before a national readership as Lincoln's first introduction to a wider constituency. Lincoln contrasted the sub-treasury proposal to the Bank of the United States, which Jackson and Van Buren had destroyed. The bank had invested and circulated the revenues of the nation, whereas the sub-treasury would keep the funds locked away, thereby shrinking money circulation and depressing living standards. The bank had paid the government dividends, while under the Van Buren scheme, the government would have to pay substantial sums to those holding the deposits. The bank had never lost a penny of U.S. funds, whereas the sub-treasury scheme was an invitation to steal. Van Buren proposed to include a penitentiary in the Treasury to guard against the expected embezzlement. Lincoln concluded the speech with a pledge of his own intentions meant to jolt his audience into motion. Activists today often hear the complaint, quote, you cannot change things. The people have been dumbed down. The establishment is too strong. Lincoln directly answered this kind of excuse for inaction. Lincoln, in fact, went on to struggle for decades to overcome the evil he spoke against in this speech, and he triumphed over it in his presidency. His words in this prophecy merit serious consideration, quote, a Democratic spokesman refers to the recent state-level elections and from their results confidently predicts that every state in the Union will vote for Mr. Van Buren at the next presidential election. Address that argument to cowards and to knaves. With the free and the brave, it will effect nothing. It may be true. If it must, let it. Many free countries have lost their liberty, and ours may lose hers. But if she shall, be it my proudest plume, not that I was the last to desert, but that I never deserted her. I know that the great volcano at Washington, aroused and directed by the evil spirit that reigns there, is belching forth the lava of political corruption in a current broad and deep, which is sweeping with frightful velocity over the whole length and breadth of the land, bidding fair to leave unscathed no green spot or living thing, while on its bosom are riding like demons on the waves of hell the imps of that evil spirit, and fiendishly taunting all those who dare resist its destroying curse with the hopelessness of their effort. And knowing this, I cannot deny that all may be swept away. Broken by it, I too may be. Bow to it, I never will. The probability that we may fall in the struggle ought not to deter us from the support of a cause we believe to be just. It shall not deter me. If ever I felt the soul within me elevate and expand to those dimensions not wholly unworthy of its almighty architect, it is when I contemplate the cause of my country, deserted by all the world beside, and I standing up boldly and alone and hurling defiance at her victorious oppressors. Here, without contemplating consequences, before high heaven and in the face of the world, I swear eternal fidelity to the just cause, as I deem it, of the land of my life, my liberty, and my love. And who that thinks with me will not fearlessly adopt the oath that I take? Let none falter who thinks he is right, and we may succeed. But if after all we shall fail, be it so. We shall still have the proud consolation of saying to our consciences and to the departed shade of our country's freedom that the cause approved of our judgment and adored of our hearts in disaster, in chains, in torture, in death, we never faltered in defending. The Whig Party printed Lincoln's speech as a pamphlet, and it, quote, received wide distribution during the ensuing campaign. Lincoln's party won the presidency and both houses of Congress in Lincoln's party won the presidency and both houses of Congress in November 1840. The Whigs prepared to reverse the anti-national measures that had brought on the economic disaster. The transnational character of the, quote, evil spirit. Despite the election outcome, the plans of Lincoln's party quickly came under attack in a shocking turn of events. Enemies of American economic sovereignty struck against the Whig program. The true nature of those enemies, the nature of the, quote, evil spirit that reigned in Washington, will become clear when we look at how those same hostile forces attacked the sovereignty and rights of foreign nations, disgracing the United States. President Harrison was inaugurated in March 1841. He soon sank with a fever and died 1 month after taking office. The vice president who assumed the presidency was John Tyler, a Virginia anti-national plantation owner. Tyler had been put on the Whig election ticket to get Southern votes against Van Buren. He had only joined the Whigs because he resented Andrew Jackson for having threatened to force South Carolina not to break up the Union. Tyler immediately made it clear he would double-cross the Whigs. Senator Henry Clay pushed through a bill repealing the Van Buren sub-treasury scheme and another bill establishing a new Bank of the United States. President Tyler vetoed the bank bill. At this point, a prominent Whig congressman, Caleb Cushing of Massachusetts, shocked his party by supporting Tyler, helping to shift the political balance to the anti-national side. The Whigs lacked the necessary two-thirds majority needed to override the bank bill veto. Tyler was thus sustained in his betrayal of the nation's political intentions expressed in the 1840 election, and he ushered in an era of Southern planters' power in Washington. The turncoat Whig, Caleb Cushing, was the political representative and kinsman of a set of intermarried elite Massachusetts families, the Boston Brahmins. They had been associated with the British side in the American Revolution and had later made their fortunes smuggling opium into China. During Tyler's presidential term, China's government surrendered to the British bombardment and arson, allowing free trade in opium and ending the First Opium War. Treaties forced on China in 1842 and 1843 made China pay for confiscated opium and for Britain's war expenses. China ceded Hong Kong to Britain, and Britain got extraterritoriality. Britons in China became exempt from Chinese laws and could only be tried by British authorities. With China burned and grieving, the Boston opium smugglers now asked the U.S. government to get a treaty from China, giving them the same right to plunder as had been granted to Britain. In 1843, the Tyler administration sent Caleb Cushing as commissioner to China to procure such a treaty. On his way, Cushing was celebrated by British authorities in the Mediterranean and in India. He arrived in China with 4 U.S. warships. When he threatened a new war, China submitted to the 1844 Treaty of Wanghe. granting extraterritoriality to Americans and giving the U.S. the same trading rights as the British. Abraham Lincoln, as president, would send his own ambassador to China to correct this betrayal of American principles 17 years later. On his way back from China, Cushing stopped off in Mexico for an extensive intelligence-gathering tour to prepare for war to seize Mexican territory. President Tyler had begun the process of annexing Texas to the United States. The slave South wanted Texas as one or more new states, hoping to increase the power of slaveholders within the government. Mexico had warned in 1843 that it would resist annexation, and war was expected. Cushing's 1845 report on Mexico was exhaustive and authoritative and was used extensively by the succeeding Polk administration when it made war on Mexico. Abraham Lincoln would oppose that war and risk his career in faith to his 1839 pledge to resist the evil spirit in Washington. The gift to Britain and the war with Mexico. An 1842 U.S.-UK treaty setting the southern border of Britain's Canada colonies left open the burning question of the Oregon Country. This was all the land between California, then a state of Mexico, and Alaska, a province of Russia. Previous agreements had kept this huge extent open to joint settlement by the U.S. and Britain. American medical missionary Marcus Whitman had led pioneer American settlers out to the territory and befriended the native tribes. The British did not settle there, but sought to keep the Americans out and used their own Catholic missionaries to pit the Indians against white settlers. For the 1844 U.S. presidential election, the Southern-dominated Democratic Party appealed for the vote by claiming to believe, quote, that our title to the whole of the territory is clear and unquestionable, that no portion of the same ought to be ceded to England. The Democrats nominated James K. Polk of Tennessee, whose presidential campaign featured the slogan, 54-40 or fight, referring to the latitude of Alaska's southern boundary. Polk had been Speaker of the House, a chieftain of the politically aggressive slave owners. The Polk campaign slogan regarding Oregon was a ruse, as will be seen. Abraham Lincoln gave impassioned support to Polk's 1844 opponent, Whig Party leader Henry Clay. For the Clay campaign, Lincoln spoke on the National Bank as the creation of America's founding fathers, denounced the annexation of Texas, and argued for restoration of the protective tariff. Clay favored U.S. westward expansion, but cautioned against Texas annexation because it would bring war with Mexico. The anti-slavery Liberty Party attacked Clay for not strongly enough denouncing Texas's annexation. They took just enough votes away from Clay to win New York for Polk, the slave power leader, and that state provided the narrow margin that made Polk the president. The New York abolitionists thus brought about the extension of slavery. With the president-elect's blessing, outgoing President Tyler pushed through the Congress both the annexation of Texas and Cushing's bloody treaty with China. On June 25, 1845, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to move his troops from Louisiana into and through Texas, far to the south of Texans settlements, preparatory for war with Mexico. The following month, Polk proposed, through his ambassador in London, that the U.S. would cede to Britain half of the Oregon Country, i.e., that part of the Pacific Coast territory north of the 49th parallel, including all of Vancouver Island. Early in 1846, Polk sent John Slidell, a slave power intriguer from Louisiana, to Mexico, ostensibly to negotiate Mexican surrender of its land in exchange for U.S. forgiveness of millions in damage claims. While Slidell was waiting in Veracruz to be received by the Mexican government, Polk sent a naval squadron into Mexican waters and ordered U.S. troops into position on the Rio Grande River far to the south of any American settlements in territory long settled by Mexicans. Thus provoked, the Mexicans refused to receive Slidell. The British, satisfied that America would attack Mexico and not Britain, sent Polk a Pacific Coast treaty on the terms he had proposed. On April 26, 1846, Mexican forces finally responded, defeating a scouting party of U.S. invaders just north of the Rio Grande, in a Mexican ranching area known as Los Tejidos, the pasture lands. When news of the clash reached Washington, Polk audaciously asserted before Congress that the Mexican government, after a long-continued series of menaces, have at last invaded our territory and shed the blood of our fellow citizens on our own soil. On May 13, 1846, Polk signed the Congressional Declaration that the United States was at war with its sister republic. Despite some Whig protests, the American public generally supported and enthusiastically volunteered for the war. 1 month later, June 15, 1846, the Senate approved a monumental gift to the British Empire, a treaty dividing between the United States of America and Her Majesty the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, the territory on the northwest coast of America. By the treaty, the U.S. acquiesced in British ownership of what is now called British Columbia. This dirty deal took the threat of war with Britain out of the equation, clearing the way for the intended war with Mexico. The Party of War and Free Trade. 6 weeks later, Congress passed Polk's proposed free trade tariff law, allowing British imports to dominate American markets. The tariff of 1846 reversed the protective tariff of 1842, under which U.S. iron output had tripled in 4 years. U.S. iron production now stagnated for many years, until Abraham Lincoln's presidency with its fundamental shift in trade policy. On August 3, 1846, President Polk vetoed a bill funding improvement of rivers and harbors, declaring the intended projects only beneficial to individual states and therefore unconstitutional for national government sponsorship. He warned that if the bill were not blocked, it would lead the way to, quote, the most extended system of internal improvements by the federal government in all parts of the Union, unquote. 3 days later, Polk signed the Independent Treasury Act of 1846, restoring the scheme that Lincoln had scathingly attacked in his Volcano of Corruption speech. That same August 1846, Abraham Lincoln won election to the United States House of Representatives as the only Whig member of the Illinois congressional delegation. During the customary waiting period of more than a year between his election and the next session of Congress, Lincoln began acting to serve a nation suffering from degraded public opinion and treacherous leadership. As he had foreseen in 1839, he would have to defend the cause of my country, deserted by all the world beside, and I standing up boldly and alone and hurling defiance at her victorious oppressors. Lincoln, in 1847, was the lead organizer of the pioneering Alton and Springfield Railroad. He had earlier introduced the first bill in the Illinois legislature to charter the company. Now he appealed to the public to subscribe to its stock with a $5 down payment per share and thereby fund the railroad's construction. They should have faith that the projected line would soon be connected to some railroad to be built from the East Coast. It would then, quote, become not merely a local improvement, but a link in one of a great national character, retaining all of its local benefits and superadding many from its general connection. When the Tariff Law of 1846 sharply reduced import duties, iron producers and related industries suffered immediate closures and layoffs in anticipation of ruinous competition. But the protective tariff was politically dead in that era. Lincoln prepared himself for the future, when free trade would inevitably lead to a crisis and induce a policy reversal. Lincoln's economics, labor rights, not money worship. During the 1846 to 1847 period before his congressional service, Lincoln studied political economy. He wrote notes to himself, constituting a coherent argument for national protection of manufacturing. What Lincoln wrote then would be most enjoyable and instructive to those citizens who suspect that our present economic system is a disaster and our economists are fools. Lincoln proposes at the outset to show that protective tariffs provide products, quote, of lower cost in terms of the hours of labor used to produce them, compared with free trade tariffs. He first excludes from the main discussion those imported articles, quote, which by nature cannot be produced in this country. If a duty tax on imported goods of 3 cents a pound is imposed on coffee, for example, its effect may be that the consumer will pay 1 cent more per pound than before, the foreign producer will take 1 cent less, and the merchant 1 cent less in profits. He now considers the duty which fully protects American manufacturers during the period when they learn to employ the best technology. If such a duty is imposed upon an article which can be produced here with as little labor as in a foreign country, such as iron, the duty will cause that article soon to be, quote, sold to our people cheaper than before, at least by the amount of the cost of its carrying it from abroad. He says that, quote, all carrying of articles from the place of their production to a distant place for consumption, which articles could be produced as good quality in sufficient quantity and with as little labor as at the place carried from, is useless. Lincoln gave an example. A Pennsylvania farmer and a Pennsylvania iron maker whose lands are adjoining. Under the protective policy, the farmer furnishes the iron maker with all his food and receives in return all the iron utensils, tools, and implements he needs. In this exchange, each receives all of that which the other man gives up. Quote, and the reward of labor between them is perfect, unquote. Each gets the product of as much labor as he himself has put into what he gives up. But Lincoln now considers the change when the protective policy is abandoned and the farmer decides to buy his iron goods from British manufacturers. This he can only do by a direct or indirect exchange of the produce of his farm for them. Suppose the farmer wants to exchange 10 barrels of flour, which cost him 100 hours of labor, for the largest quantity of iron goods that he can get. Quote, in intrinsic value, the things to be so exchanged are precisely equal. But before this exchange can take place, the flour must be carried from Pennsylvania to England, and the iron from England to Pennsylvania. Quote, the wagoner who hauls the flour to Philadelphia takes a part of it to pay him for his labor. Then a Philadelphia merchant takes a little more for the storage and forwarding commission, and another takes a little more for insurance. Then the ship owner carries it across the water and takes a little more of it for his trouble. Still, before it reaches the English manufacturer, it is told 2 or 3 times more for storage, hauling, commission, and so on, so that when the English manufacturer gets it, there are but 7.5 barrels of it left out of the original 10 that left the farm. The iron, too, in its transit from England to Pennsylvania, goes through the same process of tolling, so that when it reaches the farmer, there is but 3/4 of it left. Thus, the farmer and the English manufacturer have each given up 100 days of labor and each gotten only 75 days of labor in return. The carrying in this case was utterly useless and ruinous in its effects on the farmer. The farmer gets only 3/4 as much iron for his flour as he used to get, but he cannot reverse course and start buying it again locally because, with no customers, the Pennsylvanian has quit making iron and has none to sell. Lincoln then attacks the foolish popular notion that it is generally in one's self-interest to buy things at the cheapest money price and sell things at the highest money price. The same change in affairs that allows a worker to buy things at half the former price often causes him to work under worsened conditions or to lose his job. The future president then sets forth his own philosophy directly contrary to money worship. Quote, except for the light and air of heaven, No good thing can be enjoyed by us without having first cost labor. And since most good things are produced by labor, it follows that all such things of right belong to those whose labor has produced them. But it has so happened in all ages of the world that some have labored and others have, without labor, enjoyed a large proportion of the fruits. This is wrong and should not continue. To secure to each laborer the whole product of his labor, or as nearly as possible, is a most worthy object of any good government. But then the question arises, how can a government best effect this? In our own country, in its present condition, will the protective principle advance or retard this object? Upon this subject, the habits of our whole species fall into three great classes: useful labor, useless labor, and idleness. Of these, the first is only is meritorious, and to it all the products of labor rightfully belong. But the two latter, while they exist, are heavy pensioners upon the first, robbing it of a large portion of its just rights. The only remedy for this is to, as far as possible, drive useless labor and idleness out of existence. Lincoln now gets to the heart of the problem facing the country, that the South is kept unindustrialized as part of the imperial system. He says that the uselessness of the unnecessary carrying labor is, quote, glaringly obvious in relation to the cotton goods we purchase from abroad. The raw cotton from which they are made itself grows in our own country, is carried by land and water to England, is there spun, wove, dyed, stamped, etc., then carried back again and worn in the very country where it grew, and partly by the very persons who grew it, i.e., slaves. Why should it not be spun, wove, etc., in the very neighborhood where it both grows and is consumed, and the carrying about thereby dispensed with? Has nature interposed any obstacle? Are not all the agents, animal power, water power, and steam power, as good and as abundant here as elsewhere? Will not as small an amount of human labor answer here as elsewhere? He aptly chose as a concrete example cotton produced in South Carolina exchanged for textile manufacturers in Manchester, England. These specific locations were pertinent to the political reality underlying the threat to America's national existence. South Carolina was the home of secessionism, and the South Carolina doctrine of free trade was most closely identified with the Manchester School of Economic Thought. Lincoln closes by ridiculing a post-industrial society. The image he uses will help us reflect on the late 20th century destruction of U.S. industry that was rationalized as a new service economy, with its enormous mass of unproductive labor, such as private health insurance bureaucrats, financial manipulators, and prison guards. Quote, if at any time all labor should cease and all existing provisions be equally divided among the people, at the end of a single year there could scarcely be one human being left alive. All would have perished by want of subsistence. So again, if upon such division all that sort of labor which produces provisions should cease, and each individual should take up so much of his share as he could and carry it continually around his habitation, although in this carrying the amount of labor going on might be as great as ever, at the end of the year, the result would be precisely the same. That is, none would be left for the living or for living. America's Unnatural War and Presidential Lies. Well, I think we've reached the noon hour, and so I'm going to stop reading here. I once again commend to you, which will be published, I believe, within the next couple of weeks. You can check with Anton Chaitkin on his Substack for the latest, and definitely follow Anton Chaitkin over there at Substack as the publication process is finally brought to an end, and we will get our copies of Who We Are, Volume 2 by Anton Chaitkin. Thanks very much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the reading today, and get yourself a copy as soon as possible. We'll see you on Thursday. Have a great day. Bye-bye.